1973, a steel mill in Pennsylvania. A man reaches into a machine to clear a jam. No lockout, no guard, just his bare hands. The foreman walks over and says one thing: "Can you finish your shift?" That was work before safety rules. Back in the day, the word safety meant something different. It meant watching your own back. It meant knowing which machines could kill you and which ones would just hurt. It meant going home with all your fingers and counting yourself lucky. There were no safety committees, no mandatory training videos, no posters on the wall reminding you to wear your hard hat. There was just you, the job, and whatever common sense you'd picked up along the way. If you grew up in that era, you know exactly what I mean. Your father came home with burns and cuts that nobody talked about. Your uncle had a limp from something that happened at the plant. Your neighbor was missing part of his hand, and when you asked about it, he just shrugged and said, "Work, that was normal. That was just how things were." Kids today will never understand what it meant to work without a net, to climb scaffolding with no harness, to breathe in dust and fumes that nobody told you were poison, to operate machines that could take your arm off if you blinked at the wrong moment. Those were different times, tougher, more dangerous. And the men who survived them, they earned every single gray hair on their heads. But here's what most people don't realize. It wasn't just about missing equipment or careless bosses. There was a whole culture around danger, unwritten rules that kept men alive when nothing else would. And if you didn't learn those rules fast, you didn't last long. Every factory, every mill, every construction site had its own set of rules, not the ones posted on the bulletin board. The real rules, the ones the old-timers taught you on your first day. Rule number 1, never trust a machine, even if it's off, even if it's been off for an hour. You treat every piece of equipment like it's waiting to bite. Because sometimes the power comes back on without warning. Sometimes a gear is still spinning down. Rule number 2, watch the guy next to you, not because you don't trust him, because you do. If he makes a mistake, you might be the one who pays for it. And if you make a mistake, you want someone there to pull you back. Rule number 3, know your escape routes. Before you start any job, you figure out how to get away. Where's the nearest exit? Which way do you run if something catches fire? What do you grab onto if the scaffolding starts to shake? Rule number 4, never show weakness. This one was complicated. If you got hurt, you didn't complain. You didn't go to the foreman asking for time off. You wrapped it up, gritted your teeth, and kept working. Because showing pain meant showing vulnerability. And vulnerable men got passed over for overtime, got let go when layoffs came. These rules weren't written down anywhere, but every man who lasted more than a few months knew them by heart. They were passed down from father to son, from veteran to rookie. From the guy who'd been there 20 years to the kid who just walked in, and they worked. Mostly when they didn't, people got hurt, or worse. But what happened when the rules weren't enough? What happened when something went wrong despite everything you knew? The answer tells you a lot about what it really meant to work in the 70s. Let me tell you about a moment. A moment that happened in factories all across America. It's a Thursday afternoon. The machines are running loud. The air is thick with metal dust and the smell of cutting oil. A guy named Eddie is working the press. He's done it 1,000 times. Foot on the pedal, hands on the metal. Quick motion, done. But this time something sticks. The piece doesn't fall away clean. And without thinking, because thinking takes too long, D reaches in to clear it. The press comes down. For a second, nothing. Then the screaming starts. Not Eddie's screaming. He's too shocked for that. It's the guy next to him, the one who saw it happen. They get Eddie's hand out. It's bad. Real bad. Someone wraps it in a shop rag. Someone else runs for the foreman. The machine keeps running because nobody thought to shut it off. And here's the thing that might surprise you. Eddie went back to work the next week. His hand was bandaged. He'd lost the tip of one finger, but he was there, clocking in, doing a different job, one he could manage with 9.5 fingers. That was the reality. There was no long-term disability, no paid medical leave. You got hurt, you healed as best you could, and you went back. Because the bills didn't stop coming just because your hand didn't work right anymore. But Eddie's story was just one of thousands. Every industry had its own dangers, its own ways of breaking a man. And some of them didn't just hurt you in the moment. They killed you slowly, over years, in ways nobody understood until it was too late. Not every danger made a sound. Not every threat came with a warning. In the coal mines, men breathed in dust that settled in their lungs like wet cement. They called it black lung, and they talked about it like it was just part of the job, something that happened to old miners. Something you didn't worry about until you couldn't climb a flight of stairs without gasping. In the shipyards, asbestos was everywhere. They used it for insulation, for fireproofing, for 100 different things. The workers handled it with bare hands, breathed it in every day. Nobody told them it was poison. Nobody knew, or if they knew, they didn't say. In the auto plants, the paint booths were clouds of chemicals. The welding stations filled the air with fumes that made your eyes water and your head spin. Guys would joke about getting high on the job. They didn't realize the joke would catch up with them in 20 years. In construction, the noise alone was enough to destroy you. No ear protection, no limits on exposure. Men went deaf so gradually they didn't notice until they couldn't hear their grandchildren's voices. These were the invisible killers, the ones that didn't leave scars you could see, the ones that waited, patient, quiet, deadly. And the worst part, by the time you realized what was happening, it was already too late. The damage was done. The years of exposure had added up, and there was nothing anyone could do but watch it play out. Maybe you knew someone like that, a grandfather who coughed every morning, an uncle who couldn't hear you unless you shouted, a father who got tired too easily, too young. Now you understand where it came from. Let's talk about what was missing. The things we take for granted now that didn't exist or weren't required back then. Hard hats, optional in most places. A lot of guys wore cloth caps or nothing at all. The thinking was simple. If something falls on your head, a piece of plastic isn't going to save you anyway. Safety glasses, sometimes, if the company provided them. If they weren't scratched so bad you couldn't see through them. If wearing them didn't mark you as soft, gloves depended on the job. A lot of guys refused to wear them because they cut down on dexterity. You couldn't feel what you were doing. And in work where a millimeter mattered, feeling was everything. Steel-toed boots, your own expense, a week's pay for a good pair. A lot of young workers couldn't afford them. Harnesses for high work, almost never. Men walked steel beams 30 stories up with nothing but balance and nerve. They called it walking iron, and they were proud of it. Ear protection. What's that? Respirators. Only in the worst conditions. And even then, the masks were crude, hot, uncomfortable. This wasn't neglect, exactly. It was a different mindset. The job had to get done. Equipment slowed you down. And everybody believed that if you were careful enough, tough enough, you'd be fine. Until you weren't. But even without proper equipment, men found ways to protect themselves. Improvised solutions, homemade fixes. Some were ingenious. Others were just desperate. When the company wouldn't provide what you needed, you figured it out yourself. Welders made their own shields out of scrap metal and dark glass. Not as good as the real thing, but better than nothing. A lot of welders went home with arc eye, a sunburn on your eyeballs that felt like sand rubbed into your skull. Guys working around caustic chemicals would coat their hands in petroleum jelly before shifts. It didn't stop the burns, but it slowed them down, gave you a few extra seconds to wash off. Construction workers stuffed cotton in their ears. It barely helped, but it was something. Miners wore bandanas over their faces. The fine dust went right through, but it caught the bigger particles. And everywhere, men learned to position their bodies for the least damage. If a machine was going to grab you, better your left hand than your right. If something was going to fall, better your shoulder than your head. That's what survival looked like. Calculated risk, managed harm. The acceptance that getting hurt was inevitable. The only question was how bad. But there was one thing that protected workers more than any equipment ever could. Something invisible. Something powerful. The best safety equipment in any factory was the guy next to you. You watched out for your crew. They watched out for you. When someone was tired, distracted, moving too fast, you called it out. When someone was about to make a mistake, you stopped them, even if it meant slowing down the line. Because the foreman's anger lasted 5 minutes, a crushed hand lasted forever. There was a bond between workers that's hard to explain. You might not like the guy at the next station, but inside those walls, his life was in your hands, and yours was in his. I bet you remember that feeling. The way you'd automatically scan the area when you arrived, making sure everyone was where they should be, noticing if someone seemed off, and the stories. Every factory had them. Near misses, close calls, times somebody almost died and didn't. These stories got told and retold in the break room, at the bar after work. Not for entertainment as warnings, as reminders that this job could kill you if you stopped paying attention. Those stories saved lives, maybe not in ways you could measure, but in the way they kept danger fresh in everyone's mind. But even brotherhood couldn't stop everything. Some accidents happened anyway, and what companies did when workers got hurt. That tells you everything about the era. Here's what happened when a man got injured on the job in 1973. First, they'd get him off the floor, stop the bleeding, call for the company nurse if there was one. Most places didn't have one. Then someone would drive him to the hospital. Not an ambulance, that cost money, just a supervisor or coworker with a car. At the hospital, questions would start. How did this happen? And here's where it got complicated. If the injury was clearly the company's fault, there might be consequences. For the company, but also for the worker. So a lot of men lied, said it was their own mistake, said they weren't paying attention. Anything to keep from being labeled a troublemaker, because troublemakers got fired. Workers' compensation existed, but it was a maze. Forms to fill out, waiting periods, and the payments were never enough. Not enough to cover bills, not enough to make up for lost wages. So men came back to work too soon, with injuries that hadn't healed, with pain they'd learned to ignore, because the alternative was losing everything. Maybe your father had an injury like that, one he'd never quite recovered from, one that changed how he moved, how he worked, how he lived. Now you know why he never talked about it. We need to talk about the ones who didn't come home. In 1970, before OSHA existed, about 14,000 workers died on the job every year in America. 14,000, that's almost 40 people every single day. Fathers, sons, brothers, husbands gone. Some died in big accidents, explosions, building collapses, mine cave-ins. Those made the news, but most deaths were quieter. A man who fell from a roof, a man who got pulled into a machine. These deaths didn't make headlines. They were just statistics. The company would send flowers, maybe a representative to the funeral, a small payout if there was insurance. And then they'd post a job opening, because the work didn't stop. It never stopped. Life was tougher then, and for some families, it ended too soon. December 29, 1970. President Nixon signed the Occupational Safety and Health Act into law, and everything began to shift. It didn't happen overnight. Changes came slowly. Inspectors showed up at factories, citations got issued. Companies started buying equipment they'd never bothered with. Hard hats became mandatory. Guards went up around machines. Within a few years, workplace deaths started dropping. Injuries declined. The invisible killers started getting identified and controlled. The old-timers had mixed feelings. Pride in what they'd survived, relief that things were getting better, and sometimes anger. Anger that it had taken so long, anger at all the friends they'd lost. Anger at years of damage to their own bodies that couldn't be undone. Here's what I want you to understand about the men who worked before safety rules. They didn't think of themselves as heroes. They weren't trying to prove anything. They just went to work every day in conditions that would terrify most people today. But their bodies told a different story. The missing fingers, the bad backs, the hearing loss, the lungs that never worked quite right. Every mark was a story. Every limitation was a memory. They carried those things into retirement, into old age, into years when they should have been resting, but couldn't because something always hurt. If you knew men like that tanned, most of us did, you saw it, without understanding it. Grandfather couldn't straighten his arm all the way. Father flinched at certain sounds. Uncle wouldn't talk about certain things at the plant. Now you know. Now you understand what they were carrying. Life was tougher then, no question. The men who worked in factories and mills and mines before safety rules paid a price that's hard to imagine now. They lost fingers and eyes and hearing. They breathed in poison they couldn't see. They watched friends get hurt and sometimes watched friends die. And they kept going, not because they were brave, because they didn't have a choice. That's what providing for a family meant. That's what work meant. You took the risks because the alternative was worse. You showed up because people were depending on you. You survived because giving up wasn't an option. Their sacrifice mattered. Every man who went home with an injury and showed up the next day anyway, every man who learned the unwritten rules and passed them on, every man who watched out for the guy next to him, the safer world we live in now, was built on their pain. Honor them. Remember what they gave. And understand that progress sometimes comes at a cost that can't be measured. Someone had to work before there were safety rules, and millions of men did, every single day. If you worked in those days, or someone in your family did, I'd love to hear your stories. What do you remember? What did the job cost? Sometimes the hardest stories are the ones most worth telling.